The Alter Rebbe passed away 10:30 Motzei Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Shmeis, Elech of Dal Tevis Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel. And I already told you last week that 5 days before he passed away, he writes his gallbladder burst, and he suffered an agony, terrible Yisur that Rebbe had for those 5 days of his life, until he passed away. Motzei Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Shmeis, Elech of Dal Tevis Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel. So I was telling you that the Rebbe made this Fabrengen, and he wanted to start the Fabrengen at the time the Alter Rebbe passed away. So the Machzedek says the Alter Rebbe passed away Chatzi Shah Achas Esrei, 10:30 at night. Now in the winter time, Shabbos goes out, let's say 5:30, 5:45. There's no reason to start a Fabrengen 10:30 at night. You could easily have started 9:30 or even 8:30 and even 7:30. But the Rebbe made the Fabrengen 10:30. He called it for 10:30 because he wanted to start a B'diyah Gnoi at the moment Alter Rebbe's Histalkus. So Rabbi Berlipsker, our Rabbi Berlipsker, told me the Rebbe came in 10:37. So all the Chassidim was saying that the reason he came in 10:37 is because that's the precise moment of the Histalkus. How the Rebbe knows these kinds of things, this is Rebbe's Kezachen, but the fact is he came in 7 minutes late, and you need to understand that for most of the years of the Rebbe's Nesius, you could set your clock by the Rebbe. The Rebbe was, I remember this as a child, he was precise to the second. 1:30 was never 1:31. It was always exactly on time. So the Rebbe is coming in 7 minutes late. Chassidim took it as a Rebbe, and this was the exact moment of the Histalkus. The Alter Rebbe's Guf Kodesh was carried from from Piene to Hadich. The 3 people who carried Alter Rebbe's remains were his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, his other grandson, Reb Menachem Nochem, the middle Rebbe's oldest Bechor, and his great-grandson, the 8-year-old Rebbe Baruch Shalom. Rebbe Baruch Shalom was our Rebbe's Zayder's Zayder. And he was an 8-year-old who was a big bardas, was special. And he was very close to the Alter Rebbe, to his great-grandfather. And his whole life, the Frierdiker writes, his whole life he had a certain sadness about him because he literally never recovered from the Histalkus of his Zayd, of his Elter Zayd, of the Alter Rebbe. He was a big bardas. The Alter Rebbe had a special connection to him. He taught him in Yonim that he didn't teach other people, like the Kriyas HaTeira, the Trop of Emes, of Mishnei Tilim, it was incredibly cold. They carried Alter Rebbe on a sled. They would stop in a kretschman, an inn, to warm up. But they wouldn't all 3 go inside. 2 would go inside, and 1 stayed with the Guf Kodesh and Alter Rebbe. They would take turns. And this Kama Maises, the Goyim thought they were carrying a treasure. They wanted to kill them. The Goyim got drunk and they fell asleep. They were able to escape. Another story which is told that the khaizer, the Davarach, started to be mechatet. It started to roost under the Guf Kodesh. Alter Rebbe's Guf was suspended in the air like the mice with Eliezer Rebbe Avraham. They took him to Hadich. Alter Rebbe was buried in Hadich, interned in Hadich. And that's where the Alter Rebbe's Tzion is. Now, one of the interesting details about the Rebbe's Histalkus was that when Alter Rebbe passed away, his son, Memale Mekemi, the Mittel Rebbe, was not around. Why was the Mittel Rebbe not around? Because remember, the Alter Rebbe had burnt his house to the ground when he ran away from Napoleon. So he had no place to go back to. He had no home in Liadi. So the thought was, the war, when the Mittel Rebbe left, the war wasn't over, but it was ending. I read in a Rishima someplace, from Chassidim Azoi, that the Alter Rebbe's Histalkus was at the moment the very last French soldiers crossed the border from Russia back into France. So Alter Rebbe had no place to go back to. So the decision was made that he should at least temporarily relocate to a city called Kremenchug. And the Mittel Rebbe went there to purchase homes or to rent homes, to make accommodations. Alter Rebbe should push it in a Yiddish Kehillah. He was living deep in Russia, there was no Jews, and so on. When the Mittel Rebbe came back, he found out that Alter Rebbe was nistalak, he chalished. So they revived him and he chalished again. It got to the point that it was clearly a sakona pashat. He kept on fainting. So they revived him and they told him that they lied to him. That the real Alter Rebbe was still alive. But that he was very, very, very ill. So he stopped fainting. And then slowly but surely, they broke the news to him that in fact Alter Rebbe was nistalak, repeatedly. And they were afraid for his life. So what did they do? They got a big box of ksovim, Yeshrim and Echsidis, and remember the Alter Rebbe's memorim, B'derech Klal, Alter Rebbe did not write himself. It was written by the Hanochis, by the Manichim, the Pinchas Reizes, the Mittel Rebbe, the Chaim Meishe, the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Maril. The Frierdiker said that Alter Rebbe had 5 Manichim, and they put it right next to him, and then they revived him. And when the Mittel Rebbe saw the Echsidis, the Mittel Rebbe said, "Sizdo mitvos to Leben, we have with what to live," and he stopped fainting. Now there's a story which I believe, I'm almost sure that it's in the Sefer L'Shema Eisen of Zalman Duchman, Zalman Duchman tells over these mices that he heard from the Mordechai Yedel. Zalman Duchman had a Zayder, a Mordechai Yedel Duchman, who was a Chassidish Yid, and he knew Rabbi Isaac Homler, which was not Rebbe's Chassidim, but it looks like this that Mordechai Yedel also knew Reb Nachum, because Reb Nachum, Reb Nachum had a very big Arichas Yom, lived a very, very long time. Lived into his 80s, maybe 90s, had a very big Arichas Yom. And Reb Nachum spent the last 20 years of his life living by the Oyhalim. 20 years he lived by the Oyhalim. Azeg ben Amol, Grace Elter, the Chassidim lived by Oyhalim. Most of that time he lived by his father, by the Mittler Rebbe. But in the middle, for 7 years, he moved from his father's sea to his grandfather's sea. And there were two reasons why Reb Nachum made this trip from his father's sea to his grandfather's sea, which I explained to you at length last time. So Reb Nachum was living in Hadich. Yutas Kislev was always a Fabrengen. And he would tell the whole Arichas HaSipur of Yutas Kislev. Chav Dal Tev is also a Fabrengen. So when he would tell the story, the Rebbe's Histalkus, he would say as follows. Mele de Tate, my father, but Frede had das nicht gekannt überkommen. Frede was the Alter Rebbe's daughter. She was the Becheda. She was older than the Mittler Rebbe. Mittler Rebbe was the third of 6 children. The Alter Rebbe had 3 girls and 3 boys. The oldest was Frede. The second was the Vedaleh. The third was the Mittler Rebbe, the Pashtas. She was a Meredika Bardas. The Alter Rebbe said she had Mishon. She got sick. Alter Rebbe passed away. She got sick. And she got sicker and sicker and sicker. And in Sivan she passed away the same year, 5 months later. Anerach. Before she passed away, she called the Chaver Kadisha and she said that she wanted they should bury her next to Alter Rebbe in the Ale. The Chaver Kadisha wouldn't even think of such a thing to bury anybody next to Alter Rebbe. But when it came the time for Yitzias Hanshama, she called a minyan Chassidim. And they stood around her bed and she said, Krishma, Vidu, Yemesiris Medad, all the things you're supposed to say before you die. But Merendika clarity, with Merendika presence. And when she finished, she started saying very slowly, with an incredible Yishmak, Elikai, my God. The neshama you put into me is pure. Ata Varasa, you created it. Ata Yetzata, you formed it. Ata Nafachta, but you blew it into me. Va'ata Mishamra B'kibi, you preserve it within me. And then she said, Va'ata Osid Litla Mimenu, you will one day take it back from me. And when she said those words, she shouted, O Tata Ichkum, behold, Father, I'm coming. That was her Histalkus. After such a Histalkus, they buried her right next to the Alter Rebbe. In Alter Rebbe's Eihel in Gadish, there's 2 places. One is the Alter Rebbe, and one is his daughter Freitje. This is the story of the Alter Rebbe's Histalkus. Now, before we finish talking about the Alter Rebbe, there's a story that I must tell you, which is in follicans Maisis, in Shmuz V'Sipurim. And the story basically is that 15 years after the Alter Rebbe's Histalkus, there was a Yid who was living by the Alter Rebbe's Tzion in Hadich. As I explained to you, it was common for Elter Chassidim to spend their last years living at the Alter Rebbe's Tzion or the Oil, whichever Rebbe they had lived with during their lifetime and who was madrich them and brought them closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And 2 Balabatim, 2 Jews who looked quite modern, came into the Oil and just absolutely spilled their guts. They became incredibly emotional. They cried bitter tears. And there was clearly great Histalkus and tshuva and remorse and so on. This Elter Chassid watched these 2 Jews, and it was quite surprising that such modern people would show so much emotion. So when they walked out, he approached them, and he asked them who they were. And he said, you don't look like Hasidim, and how is it that you come here and display such emotion? So they told the Chassid that we're here because your Rebbe, even though he passed away 15 years ago, was Berabim Heishiv Me'ovan. He brought us back to Tshuva 15 years after his Histalkus. And they told him the following story. That there are Erlich Yidden from a shtetl who learned and davened and served Hashem and lived a real traditional life, but they couldn't make a living. So they decided to try their luck at business, and they traveled out into the world to do trade. And Shachar Aleim Masha, they succeeded. They made quite a bit of money. They became quite successful. And every year they would alternate. Some months they were home, some months they traveled. As they were traveling, they were obviously tempted by the so-called greater world, the modern world, and slowly but surely they began making compromises. It reached a point that they were literally living double lives. At home they were frum Charedi Yidden, and when they were unterwegs, when they traveled, they were literally not frum. Anyway, once they came to a hotel to stay, and they told the hotel they want to eat. The proprietor, they want to eat. So he said to them, you look like Jews, he says. I can feed you immediately, but I can't give you kosher. If you want kosher, you have to wait. So they said, we have no time for such nonsense. We're not superstitious. We eat any food as long as it's healthy and tasty. Feed us whatever you have. Fine. So I put them in a room, and a few minutes later they heard the door to their room lock from the outside. And they realized that they were locked in, trapped. And of course the windows had bars and so on. They realized that they were being held hostage. A few minutes later the door opened, and the proprietor came in with one or two of his sons, bloodshot, looked very drunk, holding little hatchets, tomahawks they call them. And they said, we're going to kill you and take your wealth. So of course these two Jews panicked, and they began to beg for their lives. And they said, take all our money, let us go, we won't tell anybody. And they said, listen, this was the adage of the 19th century. Dead men tell no tales. If you're dead, there's no witnesses. We're going to kill you, dispose of your bodies, and that's the safest way to commit a crime which cannot be uncovered. And they begged and pleaded and begged and pleaded, and the goyim said no, get ready to die. So in desperation, they said, you know what, give us some time, we want to repent. And then these goyim walked out of the room, and they had time to do tshuva. Anyway, the door closed, and these two Yidden had so much to think about. They had been frum. They were still acting frum when around their families, but were living double lives. And they spilled their guts, and for hours they did tshuva, and they begged the Eibishter to forgive them, and begged the Eibishter to beg their wives and children that they should be forgiven, and so on. After hours and hours of tshuva, the door opens up again, and they're expecting to see the murderers. And instead, this guy walks in again with one of his sons, with a tray of kosher food, and he doesn't look drunk, and he's not angry, and he's not killing them. And he puts it down on the little table and says, Est, eat. They obviously were very taken aback. And they said to this guy, I thought we were supposed to die today. He says, no, you weren't supposed to die today. You were simply supposed to correct your ways. And they said, what is this? You come in here, threaten to kill us, and now all of a sudden you're so nice? So he told them as follows. He says, 15 years ago, a holy man passed away in this room. And shortly before he passed away, he called me. And he said to me, if two Jews ever come here, and they say that they don't need to eat kosher, you should know what you need to do. So this guy said, I have guarded this with me all these years. And when you came and you said that you didn't care about kosher, I realized this was my opportunity to fulfill the instructions of this holy man. And I had to get you to do tshuva. And he did this by threatening to kill them. And of course these two Jews were very taken by this. And they both agreed that now that they were given life, they would return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be Erlich Yidden even when they traveled. And they said to this guy, can you please tell us where this holy man is buried? You want to go to his his gravesite and be mishtateach and do tshuva some more, and of course thank him for his intervention in our assimilation. And that's why these two Yidden had arrived at Alter Rebbe's Tzion in Hadish. This is the Maisa. Now there's another seeper which I was hoping to tell you today, which is indirectly connected to Alter Rebbe's Histalkus. And I'll tell you about khaizer Azman. And that is that it says the Pelish Sforim. And the Rebbe once repeated by Fabrenga. That in Tov Kuf Ayin Hey, and this year is the 200th anniversary of Tov Kuf Ayin Hey, there were three tzaddikim who decided that they're going to bring Mashiach out tzaddikim. Not out everybody, but out tzaddikim. How are they planning to bring Mashiach? They planned that on Simchas Torah they would make Yechudim, and together they would break the khaizer and bring Mashiach again. The three tzaddikim were the Yisrael of Koznitz, the Menachem Mendel of Rimenov, and the khaizer of Lublin. They said the tzaras that are going to be now for Yidden were not going to be able to survive. What happened? The Koznitz Amagid passed away out of Sukkot. And the khaizer of Lublin was called the khaizer because he saw everything, didn't see this. So when I came to Simchas Torah, he sat down under a window to do this meditation, this Yechudim. And he told his Rebbe that she should look at him and not take her eyes off him for an instant. And he sat there deep in meditation for a very, very long time. And she was looking at him, and eventually there was a lot of noise. It was Simchas Torah. She looked away for an instant, for a second. When she looked back, she saw a hand reaching in the window and pulling him out, and he disappeared. It was a small little window. The window was full of empty beer bottles that the Chassidim were drinking for Simchas Torah. The beer bottle stayed in the window, and the khaizer disappeared. They found him a few hundred amas from the Beis Medrash, laying on the ground, groaning in pain. Every bone in his body was broken. They picked him up and they carried him to the Beis Medrash, and he said he didn't know that the Koznitz Amagid had passed away. If he had known, he would never have tried. If not for the Koznitz Amagid, put underneath him the edge of his kapata, he would have died on the spot. The Misnagdim in Lublin heard that he was sick, and they said, When he's going to pass away, we're going to make a big fabringen, we're going to say l'chaim, do a big misnagdim. But the khaizer azagetan, when I pass away, no one will be able to drink water. And he passed away in Tisha B'Av. So the Kodesh Magid passed away out of Sukkot. The Chayzim and Lublin passed away out of Tisha B'Av. He passed away Lag B'Omer, also the same year. Motzah Lag B'Omer, his Talmud, the Naftali Rapshitzer, and I told you this last time, Naftali Rapshitzer had sided with Alter Rebbe. He had passed away Lag B'Omer. Motzah Lag B'Omer, Rapshitzer Rebbe laid down on top of his Rebbe's Guf Kaddish, and he said, Rebbe, when wird Mashiach kommen? When will Mashiach come? And the already deceased Menachem and Liman have opened up his eyes, and he looked at his Talmud, says, Naftali, as ich hab gewollt, hast die nicht gelost. When I wanted, you didn't let. It's the bet davon onkommen zu kuppen a knep und grüne werden bis Mashiach wird kommen. We're going to have to come on to copper buttons and green worms until Mashiach comes. People say it means the Nazis. But these tzaddikim wanted to bring Mashiach because they anticipated the murder the Kitzaras Yidden would have, and we wouldn't be able to survive them. I saw in Teira Sholem that the Alter Rebbe disagreed with them because the Alter Rebbe Pashat knew that it wasn't yet the time for Mashiach to come. This is, so to speak, the end of the story where these tzaddikim tried to finish what they had started 2 years earlier. Unfortunately, they failed, and we're now in Golos 200 years more. This is the 200th anniversary, and I'm a believer in anniversaries. Even though it's an anniversary from Apoyli Shamaise, but it's an anniversary from Apoyli Shamaise, but the Rebbe der Tzel. So what's going to happen is this. Next time, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim. And then eventually we'll move on to the Mittler Rebbe.